So where are the gains? Who's won?
Mm.
Well, interestingly, nobody. This isn't a transfer game. This is losing what we call the gains from trade. Here's an idea, unfortunately, that Donald Trump does not understand truly. And that is that trade is mutually beneficial. Both sides of trade can benefit. And if you then say, no, we're not going to have trade, both sides can lose. It's not a transfer from the rest of the world to the US or a transfer from the US to the rest of the world. It's a stock market bloodbath everywhere.
Mhm.
And add in the short term macroeconomic consequences, the likelihood of sharp cutbacks of consumption by households and investments by businesses, and you add in what's now being factored in a very real possibility of a recession in the United States uh, in the coming months, in the year 2025. Something rather shocking relative to where expectations were just 10 or 12 weeks ago. All in all, if the case is that these tariffs are here to stay for a deep restructuring of the US economy, I see nothing but a deeply self-inflicted deep wound, I should say,
Mm.
to the U.S. That raises the other possibility that you were discussing just as I came in, which is that this is a game, that this is a negotiating game, that now country by country will come on bended knee and say, we open our markets, we invest in your country. That may be what Trump has in mind, although the claim is no, I want to bring industry back to the United States, and this is how it's going to be done. And it is true that uh, supposedly dozens of countries. I say supposedly because it's all on claim right now from the U.S. government. But dozens of countries supposedly have rapidly come forward saying, we'll open up, we'll make concessions, we'll do whatever we want to preserve access to the US market. China obviously has said, we're not even playing that game. In the first day out, China announced countervailing measures of 34% tariffs. Uh, and then, of course, Trump has threatened that as of tomorrow, the US is basically going to cut China entirely. Of course, the US production depends enormously on China's sector after sector, and US industry depends extremely heavily on the Chinese market for the end products of US goods. The US sells a lot of goods, a lot of high-tech goods to China as well. So China's not playing the negotiating game. One wonders whether maybe either by design or by the drift of events, the US play will be to try to bring Europe to the American side, and Europe imposes tariff protection against China with the fear that Chinese exports, once destined for the US, will now flood Europe. And so that Europe and the United States will get together, the West will defend itself against the Chinese threat, and that this will be the real purpose, if I could put real in quotation marks, the real purpose of these policies. Maybe it's a little unclear, but that may be what at least somebody has in mind on this. I'm in India today. Interestingly, the senior Indian official is quoted as saying yesterday that all of this is China to blame. If China hadn't entered the World Trade Organization, if China hadn't flooded the world economy with its cheap goods, we wouldn't have this problem. So we want to deal with the United States. It's China that is the enemy. Interesting. Maybe that is part of the geopolitical game here. We know that most of the American political class is obsessed with China, is determined somehow or another to wreck China, and that may be that may be an underlying reason. It's a strange way to make friends, I would say, by smashing everybody in the face and then coming back and saying we love you when you bend and kowtow and do all the rest. But maybe that is Trump's play. All in all, I'll just go back to the basics of economics, which I think are valid and real in this. The last time the United States did something like this, as you've been saying in recent days, absolutely correctly, was in 1930, when Congress, in that case, passed the so-called Smoot-Hawley Tariff. Without question, the protectionism of 1930 in the United States was an accelerant and a direct feedback that gravely weakened the world economy and prolonged the Great Depression all the way through the 1930s. There's a wonderful old classic book by an MIT economic historian that I always recommend, a book by a great late historian named Charles Kindleberger called The World in Depression, 1929 to 1939. We read it as students decades ago. There's a web chart showing the implosion of world trade in the 1930s, triggered by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. The United States has a propensity to mess up the world on occasion. It did it in 1930. It did it in 2008. Maybe it's about to do it again in 2025.
Professor Sachs, thank you for that very masterly and explanation. Just a few quick things. One of the things that really, I have to say, annoys me about much of this narrative that the world has gone out to cheat the United States is that it doesn't recognize that the trading system that we have is one that the United States itself created. It deliberately created it. Now, very briefly, back in the 1980s, one of the assignments I had as a student was to look at the economic consequences of the Vietnam War. And I spent a great deal of time over that. And I remember very well that one of the problems at that time was that the United States set out to win the war in Vietnam. It was also conducting its space program. It was doing one very good thing, which is many of the social programs of that era, the things that are bundled together as the Great Society programs. It was also competing with the Soviet Union in weapons, in the nuclear arms race. All of this together, particularly the armament side of it, was costing a huge amount of money. And it was diverting American industry from the production of civilian goods to military goods as well. Now, that was creating trade deficits. And because the United States government was very unwilling to raise taxes, in fact, there was an inclination to cut taxes, all very familiar. It was running deficits. It was running current account deficits already in the 1960s in exactly the way that you have outlined. And eventually, what happened, it was very interesting, was that people in the United States, the people within the government of the United States got together and started saying, how are we going to deal with this? And we've got to deal with this by creating an economic and trading and financial system which will result in investment in funds flowing into the United States so that we can continue to do these things that we want to do, compete with the Soviets in terms of strategic weapons, wage wars in all kinds of places, not maybe specifically Vietnam, but other places, live beyond our means, if you like, max out our credit card, if you prefer. You can use all of these terms, but go on doing that basically indefinitely. And well, one doesn't want to say that everything was done, structurally and, planned out and things of that kind, because it never is. But eventually, that was what led us to the world that we have. And you could say that there were things before that. This system was one that the United States, or at least the government of the United States, deliberately devised for itself, this system of chronic current account deficits. And you don't even have to go into discussions about you need to run deficits in order to have reserve currencies. It was actually talked about then in the 70s. I mean, you go back to the debates that took place then. I remember, because I remember being struck by it, and this was in the 1980s that I was remember reading all of this. So that's one thing I wanted to say, just by comment. The second is, what you have described as a possible reason for these tariffs, basically to mobilize the world against China. Now, that looks to me not so much as a tariff policy, as a policy of economic war. And you've taken us all the way back to the 1920s and 1930s. And again, one of the books of economics, which I read long ago, I don't pretend I remember it very well, but it was by Keynes, which is the economic consequences of the peace, which is about the policies that were followed at the time of the Versailles Conference against Germany, which were basically to sort of also wage a kind of economic war against Germany through reparations. And of course, the point was that undermined the whole structure of trade relations and undermined peace. Now, if you're going to start economic wars are not going to create peace. And I'm talking about actual peace in the way that we popularly understand it. It is going to undermine peace. It is inevitably going to divide the world into economic blocks. And when you get economic blocks that are rivalrous and hostile to each other, they will evolve inevitably into competing geopolitical and military blocks as well. Now, that doesn't secure peace, that undermines peace. Anyway, am I right about these things, or am I wrong about these things?
No, you're very much on point on both of them. And let me discuss both of them briefly. First, because of the heavy spending and the trade deficits and the printing of money or cheap credits at the end of the 1960s, we actually had a breakdown of the monetary system of that period, which was a dollar-based system called the Bretton Woods system. It had established the dollar as the formal center of the international monetary system, with other currencies pegged to the US dollar. So we did not have floating exchange rates, we had stable or fixed exchange rates. That system ended in 1971 because the US was issuing too much credit, and the dollar-based system was predicated on the idea that other countries could take the excess dollars they were receiving and convert them into gold, because the US government would exchange dollars for gold at a fixed price. The US was running out of gold step by step as countries were coming forward saying, we don't really want the dollar reserves, we want gold reserves. The dollar backing by gold was causing an outflow of gold, and the gold convertibility was suddenly suspended by Richard Nixon in 1971, and the currencies in Europe and in Japan began to float against the dollar. I mention all of this because this kind of crisis also turns into a basic change in the monetary system. And that's going to happen again in the next years. So what happened, by the way, after this was that oil prices soared in an inflationary period in the early 1970s, and the U.S. made an agreement with Saudi Arabia, very interesting, that oil would be denominated in dollars for sales internationally, and the dollars would be deposited in dollar accounts, which became called the euro dollar system, because the accounts were generally in banks in London. And so the dollars were recycled in a sense, or the oil proceeds were recycled into dollar reserves. So we had floating exchange rates, but the dollar remained the central currency for payments and settlements. And that has remained true until today. It's going to end most likely, especially if this new trade policy is sustained. Again, that big if of what the purposes are. But countries are seeing this doesn't make sense for us to hold our reserves in dollars. That's very risky. U.S. economic policy is unstable. The U.S. economy is unpredictable. The trade policies are unpredictable. And the weaponization of the dollar in confiscating Russian reserves, Venezuelan reserves, Iranian reserves, Afghan reserves, Afghanistan's reserves, and so forth, means that if you have some trade dispute or foreign policy dispute with the United States, you're likely to get your money confiscated. And more than that, with all these threats and sanctions that pour out of the White House every day, the dollar is a vehicle for enforcement, because what the United States says is, if you don't listen to us, your banks are going to be cut out of the dollar-based payment system. So all of this is to say that, just as you point out, that events similar to this of the late 1960s, early 70s led to big geopolitical change and financial change. They led to big monetary change. And I'm predicting that the US dollar will diminish markedly in its role in the next 10 years, that we truly will have not only a multipolar world, but a multi-currency world as well, especially with the rise of the renminbi as an alternative. Now, Trump knows that's very adverse to US prerogatives, and so he has gone out of his way to threaten China and threaten the BRICS. Don't you dare think about doing anything to dethrone the dollar. But can the United States really use its threats, its bluster, its trade barriers, and so forth to prevent other countries from taking preventative or remedial actions? And my feeling is that they cannot do so. The second point you raise is also extremely important. My whole career, I would say, has used relentlessly the book that you mentioned, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was written in 1919 by a young John Maynard Keynes, who had been part of the British negotiating team at the Versailles Treaty, and became deeply disillusioned by the economic warfare, the harsh reparations, and the other barriers that were going to be imposed on post-World War I Europe. And what made the book so incredibly important from my own thinking for decades is that he said a harsh peace, or this kind of economic warfare, does, as you said, conduce to war. And he predicted that within a generation, the even worse demons will rise in Europe if Europe persists in these harsh settlements, these demands on Germany and the other losing side of Europe. And indeed, of course, he was utterly right. So my whole career of economic policy making from the 1980s onward has been to say, don't enter economic wars, don't be harsh, be magnanimous in the event that an adversary faces difficulties, because if you are harsh, it will come back to haunt you. And I think that was the wisdom of John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant political economist of the 20th century, in that warning. The U.S. is out for blood with China. You could say that in a metaphorical sense, but I fear that many view it in a literal sense also, expecting war, preparing for war, thinking that war will come. Nothing could be more reckless, horrendous, dangerous, insane for this world than to think in those terms. But the animus towards China is startling. It's only rivaled by the irrational animus towards Russia, which has been a persisting fact for almost 2 centuries in the British case, and for decades in the US case. But it comes to the same thing. China is a mortal threat to US primacy. China's a mortal threat to US dominance. China's a mortal threat to US power. So it must be contained, maybe even broken. And while the trade policies of the last few days are ostensibly against the 100+ countries with which the US is running trade deficits, this absurdity that we discussed, there is an underlying sense that China is target number one. And I do think people should understand how deliberate this policy is and how much it's part of a US deep state strategy, just as NATO enlargement was a 30-year project of the United States, maybe coming to an end. We can't even be sure of that, given the machinations in Washington. But so too, the idea of somehow breaking China's rise is not a Trumpian idea, it is a Washington deep state idea. And the best way to understand such things is to look at what is being written by so-called strategists. In the case of NATO enlargement, we always discuss Zbigniew Brzezinski, who spelled out all the arguments in 1997 about why NATO should expand and why Russia would not be able to resist. And in the case of China, I refer often to a document written for the Council on Foreign Relations by Robert Blackwell and Ashley Tellis in 2015, which is entitled something like a grand strategy towards China. And the argument is China's rise is no longer in America's interest. It must be stopped, in other words. A shocking idea. We must do damage to another side, not because they threaten us, but because they are too big and therefore they undermine US hegemony. That's literally the argument in the paper, not a list of nefarious actions by China, but the mere fact, as Blackwell so directly points out in this paper, remarkably so, the grand strategy of the United States since its inception, in essence, is primacy. The United States must be number one. And so we must prevent any challenge, not whether they're doing harm, not whether they're actually a threat, but simply by their size and success. And this is the motivation for much of what's happening from 2015, the attempt to form in crazy ways new trade groups in Asia that don't include China, the export bans on technology, the attempt to destroy companies like Huawei and ZTE on rumors and machinations of of all sorts of imagined dangers. The unilateral tariffs that Trump imposed, not on the world in his first term, but specifically on China, and now the very punitive tariffs on China and the threats essentially made yesterday and perhaps something that will happen tomorrow, or as so many things with Trump won't happen tomorrow, despite the claim, the idea of massive punishing tariffs because China dares to stand up to the United States and say, no, you can't unilaterally destroy our trade. So all of this is to say there is a China animus that is an impelling part of what we're observing. How central, hard to tell, but definitely one of the deeply motivating forces, and extremely dangerous because it is deeply enmeshed in military buildups, in military alliances in East Asia, in saber rattling every day about Taiwan, and basically with the real risk that Taiwan turns itself into the next Ukraine by making the same kind of bets on US protection that Ukraine made that ended up destroying so much of Ukraine. The same thing could happen in Taiwan, but if it does, the war is going to be even more dangerous for the world, potentially utterly catastrophic. And with the instability of US economic and political leadership combined with the deep state animus towards China, it's pretty risky.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much for taking up our time. I wouldn't myself be too concerned, actually, about what Indian officials say. I think they're in the midst of trying to negotiate some kind of waiver. I'm sorry for India, by the way. I'm particularly sorry for Vietnam, Lesotho, all of these poor countries that have been dragged into all of this. People there who work very hard to build up their businesses and to make a living, they're all going to be hit by all of this. I think I can understand why some people in India are talking in this way, but I very much doubt.
And it may be that the biggest negotiations are among this small group in Washington that doesn't understand each other and that contradicts each other by the hour. So maybe this is another part of what we're watching.
Exactly. But I myself think, on the contrary, that ultimately, when everything sort of starts to settle down, countries like India will probably say to themselves, we have to actually forge even closer links with China and other countries like that, because that is a predictable relationship, whereas what the Americans are offering is a coercive one. And nobody ever likes to be trapped inside a coercive relationship. That, I think, is almost definable. That's a statistical, that's a scientific law, if you like, in history. That's what I would say.
You are so correct. You've got it 1,000% right.
Yeah. But anyway, Professor Sachs, brilliant discussion. Thank you very much again for coming and joining us.
Great to be with you.
Before you go, I know you're short on time, Professor Sachs. One question before you go from Spark.
Sure.
Professor Sachs, wouldn't it help if the U.S. would at least admit they practically forced China to take over U.S. manufacturing beginning in earnest in the 1990s?
Well, the U.S. companies ran towards China. They didn't force them to, but they ran towards China, in part because at the time China offered very low wages and efficient, diligent, capable production. Now China, of course, is a cutting-edge, remarkable manufacturing ecosystem, I think second to none in the world. But that's China's doing. Massive investment, incredible upgrading of skills, massive innovation and advancement in R&D and science and technology. But in the 1990s, U.S. companies saw a lot of profits to be made. Again, I want to say, and I do want to be clear about this, that a global supply chain, meaning that certain things get done in certain countries and other things get done in others is mutually beneficial for that whole supply chain. It does not mean the hollowing out of America. It means that American workers engage in higher productivity areas. If, again, just to emphasize this point, Trump's policy really is to push Americans to do the entire supply chain, because barriers will break apart the global supply chain. Americans are going to find themselves doing a lot of low wage, very unpleasant work that they didn't want to do, and that the American economy left behind decades ago. This will be forced back. It will not raise living standards. It will lower living standards. One more point I do need to emphasize, if I might, which is something general about trade that I didn't mention that should be mentioned. It is true, though it's subtle for the reasons I've tried to emphasize in terms of impacts, trade can hurt parts of an economy, some groups of workers, some sectors that face particular import competition, and help others. The general proposition, quite robust in history as well as in concept and theory, is that the overall benefits are positive, so that in principle, those who win can compensate those who lose, and the whole country can still come out way ahead. If you run the kind of politics that the United States has run for the last 40 years, which is a deeply plutocratic politics governed by the laws of campaign finance rather than by the determination of the common good, you don't have that kind of compensation in the American scene. Our society is very harsh. It's rather nasty. The richest people, perhaps often, are the nastiest to the poorest people. Their billions are not enough for them. And what that means is that those who do lose, not only from trade, but from technology changes, from other change in the economy, don't get helped in the American scene. They get tossed into the rubbish bin quite often. We have an underclass that persists and that grows, that has addictions and poor health and falling living standards and falling life expectancy. American society is very harsh. No one comes to their rescue. Tariffs do not save them, believe me, not even remotely, not even remotely. But the political underpinnings of some of this support for Donald Trump is the claim that he will help them because no one else has helped them. The Democrats didn't help them. The past Republicans didn't help them. So people come to Trump, help us. And he tells them, yes, I will punish China. That will be your salvation. I will punish those who are ripping us off. That will be your salvation. He peddles myths. He peddles economic ignorance, but he peddles something to people who want an answer that they haven't heard from normal politics. So I think this is just one more point that really does need to be emphasized.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for joining us.
Professor Sachs, thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you so
Talk
much.
to you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.